Professor Spencer Crew has worked at museums as well as universities over the past 25 years. Currently, the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of American, African American, and Public History at George Mason University. He served as the former director of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History and as the former president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. His primary area of research interest is African American history, and he has created exhibitions and written on both the Underground Railroad and the migration of African Americans to the North during and after World War I. Let's welcome him up.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. All right. I thank you all for coming this evening to join us on this conversation. Now, one of the things I wanted to start with is you can notice that the title I have up on the screen is called The Modern Civil Rights Movement. They can't hear me too well, so if we can get it up some more. And I do that because I wanted to be clear that there was a civil rights movement going on in the African American community before the period I'm going to talk about. And that, in fact, many of the tactics and many of the strategies used, again, that I'll talk about this evening, had been used before. And it is the coming together of, I think, a certain number of important elements that allow the 1950s and 60s to be a little bit more successful than they had been previously. Also, what I wanted to talk a little bit about is the fact that as we get into this period and we look back at what took place there, we have an advantage. And the advantage we have is that we sort of know how things turned out. We know that, for the most part, there was success. But the challenge is that at that time, the people who were involved in those activities, who were daring enough to go out and push the society to change, did not know how it was going to turn out. And for them, it was sometimes life-threatening to make these choices. And to give you a real good sense of this, there was a poll taken in 1964, which is 10, 15 years after the start of the modern civil rights movement, that was done where they talked to people around the country. And they gave the people they talked to several choices to make. And they said, first of all, do you think civil rights leaders are trying to push too fast, are going too slowly, or are they moving about the right speed? And what we found out is that from that poll, among whites, 84% of Southerners and 64% of non-Southern whites said that civil rights leaders were pushing too fast. So you can see that there is not a wave of support emerging in the country around civil rights activism. And it's important to keep that in mind as we begin to talk about that. And what I want to do is sort of give you an overview and some of the key activities that took place in what is now called the modern civil rights movement. And I think as we begin to think about this, there are some key moments that I want you to begin to focus on. Now, most often, what people think about it in terms of key activities or key moments that launched this 1950 civil rights movement are the Brown versus the Board of Education court case and the Montgomery bus boycott. And those are, in fact, very important. But there's another incident that takes place during this period that I think is just as important that doesn't always get the same kind of attention. It has to do with a young boy going to Mississippi. His name is Emmett Till, and he's a 14-year-old young man who is raised in Chicago. And his mother is a transplant to Chicago from Mississippi. And she still has relatives located there. And one summer they say, why don't you send Emmett down to stay with us for a few weeks. He can see what it's like in the South. Where his mother, having been raised there, was a little hesitant to have him do that. But after being persuaded, she said, okay, I'll let my son go. Well, what happens is that while he is down there, so the stories go back and forth, he insults the wife of a white store owner in the town of Mississippi. She claims that he tried to flirt with her, and she was not happy about doing that. Well, he leaves and goes home, but when her husband returns from a trip, she tells him about that, and he's not happy. So later in the evening, he goes to the home of the relatives where Emmett Till is staying, and they kidnap him and take him away. 3 days later, they find his body in the river. It's so badly mutilated that you cannot identify his face or much of his body. Now, the officials there in Mississippi decide, well, let's quickly bury him and get this to disappear so we don't have to talk more about it. But his mother is a very strong woman. She takes the position that she does not want a quick burial in Mississippi, but she wants her son taken back to Chicago for a burial. And what she says is, I want the world to see what happened to my baby. I don't want it to be pushed under the rug. And so she takes the body back to Chicago and has a very large public funeral for him. Hundreds of people line up outside the church to come see his burial. And it creates a great stir and uproar in the country. People cannot believe what has happened to this 14-year-old boy in Mississippi. And what's important about it is that this is not the first time that someone has been dragged out of their house and murdered in Mississippi and other parts of the South. But this, through her courage and her determination, makes it much more of a national moment. And it's important because a lot of people who were involved in the civil rights movement in the months and years that follow refer back to the death of Emmett Till. And they see it as a key moment in terms of galvanizing civil rights activism across the country. So when we talk about sort of this catalyst that gets the modern civil rights movement going forward, you've got to think about Emmett Till. Because as I'll talk about later with the Montgomery bus boycott, even Rosa Parks talks about Emmett Till as an important inspiration for her. But this same time this is going on, we have the other two cases that are important for us to be aware of. The first is the court case that takes place before the Supreme Court. It's the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This is an interesting case because the goal here that they're trying to do is to attack the educational system in the South. What they believe they have to do is that back in 1896, there was a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And basically what the court rules in that case is that it's okay to have separate but equal facilities. And if you do that, then it's not against the law and the court sees it as permissible. Well, what the NAACP and other legal people decide to try to do is to make the school systems in the South adhere to this strictly. So that if in fact you're going to have separate facilities, separate schools, separate educational systems, they do in fact have to be equal. And their belief was that if we go down this pathway and if we force them to do this, the cost of this is going to bankrupt them. And rather than to get bankrupt, what they're going to do is to begin to allow the schools to come together just so they can save money. So initially, that's what they begin to do, is they bring court cases in which they're trying to force the South to make the facilities equal. But the Brown case is much different. At this moment, they decide to take a much different kind of stance, a much different legal approach to the issue. And what they decide that they're going to do is rather than going for separate but equal, they're going to take the position that in fact separate and equal facilities are still unequal and are detrimental to the well-being and to the educational possibilities for the students that are made to be separated. And so the case revolves around a young girl. There we go. A young girl by the name of Linda Brown. Her case is the one that's in Kansas. It's not the only case that's part of this grouping. There's a case out of Delaware, a case out of South Carolina, and a case out of Washington, D.C. that are also part of this story. But Linda Brown is sort of at the forefront of it. And the story is that in Kansas, in Topeka, Kansas, the school system is separate and in fact equal, that they do provide equal facilities for black and white students, but they're separate places. The challenge for Linda Brown is that to get to her separate but equal African-American school, she has to get up early in the morning, she has to walk across railroad tracks, catch a bus, ride for half an hour, and finally get to school before she can start her school day. And to do this, she often got to school a little bit early, had to sit outside in the cold sometimes for half an hour waiting for the school to open. Her parents didn't like this because there was a white school a half a block from her house. So they felt this was unfair and something that needed to be done about this. So what the NAACP does with Thurgood Marshall and others is to take this case forward to the Supreme Court, knowing that it is a separate and equal case, but they want to make the argument that even when it's separate but equal, it is unfair and hurts African-American children. And what's important about this is they try to use a new kind of approach to it. It's sort of a sociological approach. They're trying to use sociology and findings under sociology as a way of convincing the court that in fact separate but equal does not work, but it still means that for those kids who are separated, it hurts their sense of self-esteem, it hurts their ability to get a good education. And to do this, they use what is famously referred to as the Dowell test. This was promoted by an important sociologist, Kenneth Clark. And what he did with the Dowell test was he got 4 Dowells, 2 white and 2 black. And he would get African-American students to come in and put the Dowells in front of them. He would ask them, which Dowell is better? Which Dowell would you rather be? And inevitably, especially those who are in the South, would say, I want to be the white Dowell. I think the white Dowell is better. And they used this to argue that this separation creates a sense of inferiority for the African-American students. And that separate but equal still results in unequal treatment, an unequal sense of themselves. And as a consequence, the argument is successful. And the Supreme Court does, in fact, rule in their favor and rules that separate but equal cannot be acceptable. There we go. And the court case is ruled in favor of the NAACP and creates a movement of beginning to desegregate, or at least push for desegregation of schools all throughout the nation. Now, what we do know is that this doesn't happen quickly, that the South resists very strongly, and it takes quite a while to have any real motion to go with this. But the ruling by the Supreme Court sets a new environment, sets a new standard. As a consequence, you have now a legal basis for pushing these things forward. I'm now living, as you heard, in the state of Virginia. And Virginia was one of the leaders in resisting the idea of desegregating schools. They led what was called massive resistance, in which they even closed the schools in the state in order not to integrate them. But the court case itself is a landmark one that's very important in terms of the momentum of civil rights during this time period. The other important case during this time is, or not case, but event takes place in Montgomery, Alabama. And it happens when a woman by the name of Rosa Parks decides that she is not going to surrender her seat on the bus in Montgomery. And in so doing, she's arrested, taken to jail, and fined for having broken the segregation laws in Montgomery. Now, what's important about this is that, first of all, she is a well-respected member of that community. As a consequence, they deem her, the legal attorneys and the NAACP and others, deem her a good person to be a test case on this issue. Others before her had done this, but they felt that their background, their stories might get in the way of the central issue of the case. But with Rosa Parks, you have a person who's trained in civil disobedience, who is a member of the NAACP, and has been doing things in terms of civil rights for a long time. She's a very respected member of this community. So she becomes a perfect example for them to take to the courts to try to force the bus system to change. In addition, there were a group of African-American women in Montgomery who had been angry about their mistreatment on the buses for a long time, because it was not unusual in Montgomery for the process in Montgomery to get on the bus if you were African-American is that you go to the front of the bus, you'd get in, you'd put your money in the coin box, you'd get off and walk around to the back door and then get on. Very often what would happen, especially for many of the women, is that they'd pay their money, get off, start to walk around, and the bus would take off. And they weren't happy about that. They didn't like the segregation part of it, but they particularly didn't like the way they were mistreated. So as a consequence, this group called the Women's Political Council of Montgomery decides to help push this boycott that might take place. And in fact, the leader of that group, is a woman by the name of Joanne Robinson. She's a professor at a nearby university. And what she decides to do after Rosa Parks is arrested is she handprints 35,000 handbills in which she is pushing for a boycott of the buses in Montgomery. Her goal is to ask everyone to stay off of the buses for one day, the day in which Rosa Parks was supposed to go into court. But in fact, what happens is it turns into a year-long boycott of the buses there. And in the process of this bus boycott, you also have coming to the forefront a young preacher who is newly arrived in Montgomery, a man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., who becomes the spokesperson for what is now called the Montgomery Improvement Association. And he then becomes the person that everyone turns to get leadership and to get the latest news on what's going on. And he does this and becomes the leader of this despite the threats towards him. He's threatened with death. His house is bombed in the process, but he continues to be an important player in this process. And he turns to help, requesting help from all across the country in terms of getting people to support what they're trying to do. Now, as an important local piece of information, what I learned recently was that as part of the support that sprang up for the Montgomery bus boycott, you had a person right here in Boise who decided to lend a hand to what was taking place. Okay. I guess I've lost my place just a little bit. Okay. Her name is Mrs. Earlene Browning. And she is connected to the bus boycott in this sense. As they were requesting help, preferably money, for all the people who are walking to work, she doesn't have money, but she sends a letter to Martin Luther King, which has been found in his archives, in which she says, I am so sorry that I don't have money to give to support you. I give money whenever I can, but I just don't have the money now. But what she does decide to do is to send 2 pairs of shoes that she says, well, I can't give money. Okay. Well, I can't give money. I want to give these 2 pairs of shoes to women who are walking to work every day, not to ride the buses. I'm hoping that at least they'll have something comfortable to use in the course of this bus boycott. So what you get a sense of is how widespread support was, at least in the African-American community, for what was going on. And it reached as far west as way out here to Boise, Idaho. So I just wanted you to know that you have a connection to what was going on there. Now, as I said, the bus boycott itself lasts for almost a year. And in the end, it's successful, one, because of the economic loss that the bus system felt, having most of its ridership, who are African-American, not ride the buses. The other part of it is that the NAACP takes a court case into the courts, and the Supreme Court finally rules that the segregation laws in Montgomery are unconstitutional, and therefore the bus boycott is ended. Let's see if I can get this a little bit further down. All right. So this bus boycott, I think, becomes a springboard for other activism that happens in the country. You begin to see others, I think, inspired by the boycott, inspired by the Supreme Court case, and I think touched by the death of Emmett Till, to themselves get involved in this process. And with the Brown case, probably the most important follow-up case that takes place with this happens in a place called Little Rock, Arkansas. And there, you begin to have a major disruption around the idea of integrating the schools. Now, it's interesting because in Little Rock, the school board there probably was one of the most conservative ones in terms of how they approached this issue. They wanted to support the Supreme Court case, but they came up with a very elaborate plan as a way of trying to decide how to integrate the school system. Now, to put the plan together, they waited almost 2 years after the Supreme Court case to come up with their plan. And essentially what they decided they would do was that they would integrate the school system from the top down. So you would start the high school, and then next year you'd go to the middle school, and then you go to 6th grade and 5th grade and 4th grade and 3rd grade and 2nd grade, so that full integration of the school system there wouldn't happen for 12 years. And the first step in this was to allow students to go to Little Rock High School. And essentially what they did was to interview and test a number of students to see who might be strong enough and appropriate to send to Little Rock High School. And finally they identified 9 students to integrate the high school of 2,000 students. So you're not talking about a big change taking place there. And it's a very conservative segregation plan that the school board thought would work very well. It was going well until it became a political football. And what happens is that the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, is running for re-election. And he decides that this is a wonderful political football that he could use to ensure his re-election. He has a press conference in which he speaks against the integration program that's going to be put in place in Little Rock. And he then uses the Arkansas National Guard to stand guard to prevent the students from going to the high school. Now, this is a problem because it's going against the courts. And the president at the time, who's Dwight D. Eisenhower, is a little reluctant to get engaged with this. But when the courts rule that Faubus should stop this with the National Guard, and he defies them, if nothing else, Eisenhower is a person who believes in the rule of law, who believes that you have to follow orders. And at that instance, he decides to nationalize the Arkansas National Guard and to also send in airborne troopers to help protect the students. And as a consequence, the National Guard, instead of preventing the students from going in, now have the task of protecting the students as they go into the school system. And these are the nine students who are brought together to do that. There's 10 people here because the woman on the top to the right is the local NAACP leaders helping make this happen. The students are allowed to go to the school and go there for the following year. Now, what we often don't hear about is that we hear that they go to the school and we sort of think everything goes happily after this takes place. But in fact, that year is a tough one for them because they're harassed by the students there. They have their heels stepped on when they're walking down the street. Their books in the class, walking down the hallway, their books are knocked out of their arms, and they're really harassed. The idea that if they get them angry enough, then maybe they would explode, and then they could be expelled. And in fact, one student does finally, one young female student does get angry and fights back, and is expelled from the school. The others remain. But what happens is after that first year, the government then shuts down the school system entirely. So you have this ongoing struggle over the next several years to finally get the school system integrated. But what it talks about, I think, is, again, we talk about the resolution of these students. You also have to talk about the resolution of their parents. Because as the students are identified and as to who are their parents are punished economically. They lose jobs, they're harassed. So it becomes, I think, a test of courage, not only for the students, but also for their families in terms of saying that this is important enough that we're willing to make huge personal sacrifices on behalf of this effort. So with Little Rock, you begin to see the momentum growing, and you have other organizations that come to the forefront. Probably the most significant one that emerges as a consequence of these activities is an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And it's set up in 1957 under the guidance of Martin Luther King. And its task, under the leadership of King and mostly Southern African American ministers, is that they want to continue to encourage and support protest movements all throughout the South. They want to make sure that the momentum started with the Little Rock activities, with Montgomery bus boycott and other things, doesn't peter out and disappear. But how do we continue to supply support and strategies to help this movement go forward? And this then becomes the platform that Martin Luther King Jr. uses to continue his civil rights activism and move into leadership nationally for the civil rights movement. So I say what they want to ensure is that pressure continues to build on the nation, on Congress, on the courts, and on the president to push forward more advances in civil rights. Now, what's interesting about this is that in many ways, I think he and the other ministers see themselves as very aggressive in terms of what they're trying to do. And they feel the boycotts and the things that they're doing are important ways of creating change. The challenge for them, though, is that these kind of activities sometimes takes months and years to cause change to happen. And there is another younger group within the African American community who feels that maybe this is moving too slowly, that we need to do things more quickly. And what they are saying is that while what you're doing is good and will eventually turn into progress, what we want is what they say is freedom now. We want to find ways to cause change to happen much faster than it had in the past and trying to figure out what strategies that might be. And I think the first illustration of this generation, that are mostly college students and high school students, is their ideas of using other kinds of strategies to force change in the society. And the one that comes to the forefront earliest in 1960 is one that has its initiation in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the Woolworths County there. There, 4 young men from North Carolina A&T College there, an African-American school, decide that they are going to go and sit in at the Woolworths lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. What they do is, first of all, they let the local newspaper know what they're going to do. They go in, buy something at the store so they are customers. They then go to the lunch counter and sit down and order food. Now, the waitress refuses to do that because that's the policy of the store. And expects that they will get up and leave. They refuse to do that. Instead, they sit there quietly and refuse to move until the end of the day. When the store closes, they leave and go home. But the next day, they come back and they're joined by others. And you see this idea of sit-ins as a strategy spreading across the South. During the time that they're involved in this, you see sit-ins taking place with students from different African-American schools joined by their counterparts in some of the other schools in 11 different cities across the South. And what they do is they employ nonviolent tactics. And their goal is to bring economic pressure to bear on these places to change how they treat African-American customers who come into their stores. Here's the 4 young men at the Woolworths counter in North Carolina. But as I said, this idea of the sit-in at these counters spreads across the country, especially across the South. And they used nonviolence as a way of combating that. And by this, what I mean is that when they are responded to negatively, violently, people calling them names, sometimes pouring things on them, they refuse to respond. And they're trained how to do this. And they use this as a way of preventing themselves from being arrested for breaking the law or for causing a disturbance, but also bringing pressure to bear on these different stores to change their policies. And inadvertently, the people you see who are bothering them, so in the background, are actually helping their cause because they're causing disruptions for the stores. The stores cannot get customers in the door. I mean, imagine yourself coming to the Woolworths with your child in your hand, and you come to this event taking place here. You're probably going to turn around and walk away because you don't want to get involved in all this crazy going on. You don't know what's going to happen. So as a consequence, their activities, I think, have a much more rapid impact in terms of causing desegregation. As a matter of fact, within several months, they were able to force Woolworths and other of these stores to desegregate their counters and to see integration of their activities as economically beneficial to these locations. So this idea of the sit-in by these college students becomes a new strategy that they are employing and represents a younger generation who's much less tolerant and much less willing to wait longer to make things happen. And as a consequence, what they then do is to create their own organization, which is separate from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The organization they create is called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or as many of you may have heard of it, SNCC is the name of it. They organized with the idea that they want to find ways of forcing change in a much more rapid fashion and to push change quicker than they think would happen using the tactics of Martin Luther King and others like them. And they begin to search for other strategies that they can use. The sit-ins is one strategy they use, but another very effective one used by this group are the freedom rides that emerged in 1961. The freedom rides are essentially a reprise of rides that were done in the 1940s where people got together on the buses and rode into the South. This time the idea is they get a group of black and white students, male and female, to agree to get on buses in Washington, D.C., and they then travel into the South to go against the laws in the South about segregation. Because the Interstate Commerce Commission had ruled that in interstate commerce you cannot have segregation, that goes against their policies. So buses going from one state to another, their bus stations and those buses are supposed to be integrated. So what they would do is they would board in Washington, D.C. The white students would sit in the back, the black students would sit in the front, and then they would then travel to different locations in the South. And you can see the pathway that they followed in terms of their traveling from Washington, D.C. further south. One group found themselves under attack when they got to Anniston, Alabama. They were chased by an angry group. Their bus was stoned, and eventually it was set on fire. And they only barely escaped without getting injured. The second bus wasn't much better off. It found itself, the riders found themselves under attack in Birmingham, Alabama in April of 1963 and 1961. They also were attacked by the local people there, and some of them were so badly beaten that one man was paralyzed for life as a consequence of what happened there. And among those who rode on that bus and who were harmed by that is a person who's now a member of Congress. You probably have heard about quite frequently John Lewis. And I think his bravery is unbelievable because he was beaten, got back on the bus, was beaten again, got back on the bus, and continued to do what he thought was right no matter what. So these activities, although one would argue they weren't entirely successful, they did dramatize the issues faced by those who were trying just to have the laws enforced in these locations. While we see what's happening here, what we also have to realize is that while you're having success in Montgomery, you're having some success in other places, that all of the activities taking place in terms of protests weren't successful. What I don't want to create is a sense that everything went well and everything turned out the way they expected. A good example of a struggle that didn't go as well is the one that took place in Albany, Georgia. And what happened is is that they led protests, and students from, who went to school there led protests for more than a year. At the end of the year, they'd gained almost nothing. And part of the trouble was that, or the challenge was that, the sheriff there had his own strategy. And his strategy was that he was not going to do anything publicly that would bring sympathy to the protesters. So he would arrest them, they would treat them very gently and put them on buses and take them off to jail. And so you didn't have the kind of public uprising of anger that you had in other kind of instances. And as a consequence, in the course of the year, they weren't able to make much in the way of progress, and finally ended with not having accomplished what they wanted to. But I would suggest that there are lessons that are learned in Albany in terms of how you want to think about leading these kind of protests. And I think they come to the forefront not much longer with the crusade that's led in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, in the summer of 1963. That crusade is often referred to as the Children's Crusade. And it's so referred to because one of the tactics that were employed, again as a way to raise the attention of the nation to what's taking place, and to, I think, highlight the unfairness and the brutality that happened in southern towns, is that in Birmingham, what they did was to enlist the help of children, elementary school children, as you can see here, high school children, and college students, to help lead marches through Birmingham, protesting the segregation of downtown stores. What they were trying to do is to force the stores to treat African-American customers fairly, to treat them like they treated all other kind of customers. Now, it's also during these marches and during these activities that Martin Luther King himself is arrested during one of the protest marches and put into jail. And it's there that he writes his very famous letter from a Birmingham jail. And what's interesting about that letter is that it comes as a result of criticism directed towards him by local clergymen in Birmingham as well as around the country. They criticized him, one, for allowing children to be a part of these marches, and secondly, for creating trouble. Why are you doing the civil disobedience and breaking the law? And in this letter, in his response, he sort of sets out the philosophy that he expects to follow and for people to understand. And basically, first he says, children suffer segregation as badly as their parents and any other adult. So they have a right to choose to protest the way their lives are unfolding. Secondly, he argues the whole issue about just and unjust laws. And he says that there are laws that are unjust that need to be confronted, that need to be pushed back against to and overturned possibly. He's willing to accept the consequences that go with it. You might have to go to jail, you might get arrested, but he believes people who believe in justice have to stand up and to be counted for what they consider to be important. And this letter becomes, I think, an important illustration and statement for the civil rights movement, especially under Martin Luther King, the idea of nonviolence as the core of how they want to go forward and why it makes sense. And why it was important to cause these disruptions, because without the disruptions, change wasn't going to happen. So the marches in Birmingham are very important in terms of helping to set the philosophy for where they're going forward. Now, I will say that they didn't get everything they wanted in Birmingham. He's able to get a compromise of some of the things he wants. And I think part of the reason they do the Children's Crusade is they learn from Albany, that you need to create public anger and furor around things in order to force the country to pay attention and to cause change. Now, this summer of 1963 is a really important one in terms of the activities that take place in the nation. This same summer, something big happens in Washington, D.C. You all have heard of the March on Washington? That's what happens in the summer of 1963. It's a march, they say, for jobs and for freedom. They want to push the federal government and Congress to pass the civil rights law, and they want to make sure that they also do things to help people get jobs and to have better economic standing in this nation. Now, what's interesting about this is that as they were planning this, there was planning that went on for almost a year in advance of it. Congress, and especially the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, did not want them to do this because he was worried that violence would break out as a consequence of bringing all these people to Washington, D.C., because what the leaders were saying is we're hoping to bring at least 100,000 people or more to Washington to protest and to force Congress to make these changes. Well, what happens, in fact, is that 250,000 people come to this march. It's the largest march on Washington ever to take place at that time. And it's the most peaceful, quiet, relaxed march you could ever expect. None of the violence that they expected might happen took place. And it was a day, I think, of optimism and hope generated within the group. And this was highlighted, I think, at the end of the day with that last speech. And that's the speech that was given by Martin Luther King of I Have a Dream, in which he talks about the kind of world he hopes might arise as a consequence of a day like the March on Washington and the kinds of activism that was taking place across the country. And I think everyone left that day hoping that maybe things would change, that maybe life in the United States would get better, and that we were on a pathway towards greater equality and greater fair treatment throughout the nation. Unfortunately, within 18 days of the March on Washington, there's a tragic event in Birmingham, Alabama again. There you have the bombing of a church in Birmingham, the 16th Street Baptist Church, in which 4 young girls are killed on a Sunday morning as they're going to church to go to Sunday school. The reason for the bombing was because the church had been a staging area for many of the marches that had taken place in Birmingham previous to that. And also that some of the schools were beginning to have to be forced to integrate it, and whoever set off the bombs didn't want that to happen. Their hope was that this kind of violence would discourage people from continuing their efforts at trying to create change in terms of civil rights and in terms of the school system that exists there. But I would suggest that instead of causing people to change their mind, it also instead spurred them further to try to do more to create change. And probably the best illustration of that takes place the very next summer, when a group called the Council of Federated Organizations gets together and decides that they're going to hold a program to register people to vote in the state of Mississippi. That Mississippi was the perfect place to do this because Mississippi had years and years of a reputation of finding ways of trying to discourage African Americans, who were a large part of the population who have voted, could be the swing vote in key elections, to discourage them from voting. And they had done this through murders, through lynchings, through intimidation, through economic attacks on individuals as a way of discouraging them. But this organization decides that what they want to do is to create a peaceful campaign to bring democracy to Mississippi, as they described it. As you can see, help make Mississippi part of the United States. Help them allow people to vote. And the whole idea is we're going to begin to register people to vote so they can participate and have an impact on the politics in that state. What they wanted to do is to create a new party called the Mississippi Freedom Democrats. And the idea was that if they got enough people registered to be a part of that party, that they would be able to then challenge the Democratic Party already in existence in Mississippi in the hopes that maybe they could push them out of the way and get a more representative, a fair system, party in place. Now, in doing this, they did a number of things along with registering people to vote. They created freedom schools to help compensate for the educational system that was in place there. And then in the freedom schools, they do things like teach black history and other kinds of ideas to help lift the esteem of these individuals. They also had math classes and other things that were helping these students. They also opened community centers for poorer residents so that they could get legal support and medical support that they couldn't get otherwise in the state. The idea was to do this peacefully and to create change through nonviolent democratic process. And they hoped that they would be able to do this successfully without major problems, although they were worried about what might happen. And in fact, early on, they do have problems. Early in that summer, 3 young men who had just arrived in June of this summer had gone out to investigate the burning of a black church in Mississippi. They never came back. And their disappearance created a great deal of concern throughout that group. And eventually, it became a national issue because no one could find them. It was so much of a national issue that the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, sent down 200 Marines to help investigate and look for these 3 individuals. After 6 weeks of searching, they finally find their bodies buried in an old dam in Mississippi. Now, they are eventually able to identify some individuals who they thought might have committed this, but Mississippi authorities failed to charge anyone with the murder of these individuals. It's not until several years later, in 1967, that the federal government convicts 7 men for violating the civil rights of these individuals. They don't get them on a murder charge, but for violating the civil rights of these individuals. But the incident, again, rather than discouraging individuals, only causes more people to be determined, both black and white, to come to Mississippi. Over July and the next months that come along, over 1,000 individuals pour into Mississippi trying to get people to register to vote. They go door to door, talking to individuals, explaining to them what they're trying to do, and encouraging them to register to vote in the state of Mississippi. And by August of 1964, they'd gotten 80,000 people to register to vote and help to create the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Their main goal, as I said, was to mount a challenge to the regular Mississippi Democratic Party. And as it turned out, in 1964, it was the Democratic Convention to get a candidate for presidency for the United States. And so what they do is this group goes to Atlantic City, where the Democratic Convention is taking place, and they challenge the right of the Mississippi Democratic Party there already to represent the state. They say it does not represent all the members of the state, that they've excluded people through their efforts, and that their party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, better represented what the state was for. And it becomes quite a discussion that takes place at the convention. And it's, I think, very much influenced by the testimony of key members of this party. Probably the most important one that takes place is the testimony by this woman whose name is I'm blanking on names, Fannie Lou Hamer. I had the last name, the first name was disappearing on me. She offers a very powerful, I think, emotional, touching testimony. She talks about conditions in Mississippi. She talks about what happened to her when she just decided to go to a civil rights meeting. She was beaten up, thrown in jail, and mistreated for just going to a civil rights party, a meeting at that time. Now, in the end, they are not seated. One of the compromises offered was that we'll give you a couple of seats, but we can't seat everyone. They said no. Either we all get to sit down or we're not going to do this. So at the end, they don't get seated the way they want to at the party. But what's more important is what the effort represented. And it represented a push for change, but it also represented the population in Mississippi standing up for themselves, the African-American population, of saying, we're not going to quietly accept this much longer, that they went off to Atlantic City. They spoke up to the president, to the vice president, to other officials, and said what they believed was right. In addition, what they were able to do was to create new organizations, new activities in the state of Mississippi. You begin to see a much stronger political push in Mississippi and other states as a consequence of what took place in this summer, this Freedom Summer. So it's, I think, a key moment in time in terms of the political awareness and political momentum that's taking place in the South. What's also important to understand is the kind of reaction that happens out of Washington, D.C. That after this takes place and after you begin to see these activities, Lyndon Johnson creates some interesting programs that I think sort of reflect these same kinds of ideas that they have in mind. What he creates are daycare centers that are in Mississippi. He gives money for that. Creates food banks down there and cooperatives, farming cooperatives. So you begin to see the ideas that are formated during the summer become sort of national activities supported by the president. But most importantly, I think what it helps to do is to build momentum towards the passage of the 1965 Voter Registration Act. And this is also keyed by the march that takes place in Selma, Alabama. There, the SNCC and other organizations have spent quite a lot of time trying to get people to register to vote there, and they're running into really strong opposition. So to protest the opposition that they're facing, they decide to lead a march from Selma to the capital of Montgomery as a way of highlighting the lack of access to political rights that exists for African Americans in Alabama. Now, the idea is to march from Selma across the Pettus Bridge on the road to Montgomery. Well, as they're choosing to do this, they're stopped by local law officials who refuse to let them go forward. Now, again, they asked for just a few minutes to sit down, to kneel down and to pray before they moved on, and the police don't allow them to do that. In fact, they launched an attack with tear gas and horses to prevent them from doing anything in terms of going any further. This is often referred to, as you see here, as Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. And it is an event that, again, sends shockwaves across the nation. What we want to understand is that one of the things that I think is part and parcel and key to the civil rights activism of this time is the understanding of how important the media and newspapers were to trying to galvanize the country to support the kinds of law changes they are looking for. This event, I think, does shock most of the country, that these peaceful marchers are attacked for just wanting to get their right to register to vote. This is followed up by a second march, and this is the march between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. This one is much more successful. It's led by, here we go, by Martin Luther King and others, and they are protected by police and by National Guardsmen during this march. And the march itself winds up in Montgomery, where Martin Luther King and others make, I think, very powerful speeches. And it also, I think, spurs then President Lyndon B. Johnson to push Congress to pass legislation that results in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So we begin to see that there is some result, some positive things coming out of these activities. And I think the two key pieces of legislation, from my perspective, that emerge out of this activism is, first of all, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's, I think, influenced in part by the '63 March on Washington, but also the other activities. And this is probably the most sweeping civil rights legislation passed in the nation since Reconstruction at that point. It prohibits discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, religion, or national origin. The law also provides that the federal government with the power to enforce desegregation. So now you have the force of the federal government on the side of ending segregation in the nation. This is followed the next year, 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this makes it easier for African Americans in the South to register to vote and to actually vote in these elections. This legislation ends such things as literacy tests, poll tax, and other requirements that were used to stop people from voting in elections. Do you all know what the literacy test is or the poll tax? So if I asked you to explain it, you could? You're nodding yes. Explain literacy tests to us.
They asked certain people to read, and if they couldn't read, they weren't allowed to vote, essentially. But they grandfather, let us say, poor whites who couldn't read either, and let them go ahead and vote.
Partially right. Okay, that's right. Uh, the only addition I would make to that is that it wasn't just a matter of you could read or write or not. The way it worked in many places was that they would have you read a passage, say from the state constitution, and then they say, interpret it for me. And then you had to interpret it to the satisfaction of the local registrar. So what was interesting, I think, following your pathway is that you could have a PhD from Yale and read it, and the registrar would, if you're African American, say, I don't think you have that quite right. Whereas if you were not African American and couldn't read, they'd say, well, you're close enough. You got a chance to write. So it was a way of preventing people from voting because the law said you couldn't use race as a criteria for stopping people to vote. But this way, they weren't using race. They instead were using other means. And another thing they might do is you might come in and there'd be a big jar of marbles sitting on the table. And they say, all right, tell me how many marbles are in the jar. And if you couldn't answer the question, you might get it right. They'd still say no. They could decide that you weren't qualified to vote. So what this legislation does, the voting rights legislation does, is to prevent those kind of activities. And it's interesting, as an aside today, that as you watch some of these pieces of legislation that are going into place now that are looking to control the voting process in many states, again, they are aware of the fact that you can't use race as the device to prevent them. So they're finding other kinds of things, voter fraud, other kind of things, as a way of, again, sort of hearkening back to this earlier time of finding ways to stop people they don't want to vote from voting. So the 65 law is important because what it does, I think, is to unleash the political power of the African American community. And after 1965, you see many more African Americans elected on the national level, but even more importantly, on the local level, as sheriffs, as city councilmen, as mayors, and it changes, I think, the whole environment in the South. So this is a really critical and important piece of legislation. I think, as I said, these accomplishments were important steps forward in understanding the influence I think that the civil rights movement has. And it also meant that change was in the air. It was beginning to move forward. And the nonviolent protest that King was putting forward was beginning to have some impact. But King's voice was not the only voice that was part of this modern civil rights movement. And I think it's important to understand that there were other voices that didn't agree with what King was suggesting with nonviolence, who thought that maybe there were other ways in which you could force America to change and to be better and closer to what it was supposed to stand for. And among those very strident additional voices, this is the signing the 64 Act, was a gentleman by the name of Malcolm X. Malcolm X belonged to the Nation of Islam, and then he split away from it. But core to what he believed in was that he didn't think that nonviolence was the right way to respond to the violence that African Americans were facing in the South. He felt you should meet violence with violence, and he believed in the concept of black nationalism, that African Americans should work within their own communities, not look for being accepted by the larger society, but find ways to work within your own community to create change and to create independence. He is the founder of an organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and by the middle of the 60s is having a growing influence, I think, in important parts of the African American community. The tragedy, though, is that before he's able to really get this going full blast, he's murdered in February of 1963. And therefore, his voice is snuffed out. But I think this disagreement with nonviolence does not disappear with his death. In fact, that banner is taken up by another gentleman by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who is at that time the leader of SNCC. And he's changed SNCC. He's made SNCC a not so much adhering to nonviolence, and also he has pushed most of the non-African Americans out of the organization to make it a mostly African American organization. But most importantly, what he does is he coins a new phrase nationally that the press catches onto. And you can see it up there, the phrase of black power. And he does this in a speech that he gives in Seattle for the first, among other places. And in it, he defines black power in a particular way. He defines black power as an assertion of black pride. And he says the coming together of black people to fight for the liberation by any means necessary. The terms radicalism, black power, and his use of the idea of any means necessary alarms many people, especially those who believe that the real success for civil rights would happen using the nonviolent approach advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. And they thought that black power would undermine that its effectiveness and the moral authority that goes with that. They believe that if you use violence, you are sort of giving in to people who are more violent and allows changes to get redirected away from the goals they have in mind. But the reality is that what Stokely is reflecting is the frustration and the anger felt by younger members of the African American community, especially those living in urban areas, who were feeling that the economic changes weren't happening or affecting them, that all the things that were being promised were not changing their lives. And their frustration was being expressed through the idea of black power, but also you begin to see it expressed through uprisings that take place in cities throughout the nation in 1965. The largest one takes place in the city of Los Angeles in Watts. Okay. In which you see major fires and destruction take place in that city. It's followed by major race rebellions that take place in Newark, New Jersey in July of that year, and in Detroit also in July, and in other cities across the country. And I think what it really expresses is the frustration felt within those communities that they didn't control the communities, that the property that was there was not theirs, and that they were being exploited by the people who were working there. Sometimes you'd hear people say, well, they're just destroying their own communities. Well, they would argue back, we don't own these things, and we are being exploited by some of the people that run the stores there, so in our frustration and exploitation, we're just going to destroy it. Whether you agree with that or not is another question, but that is a real expression of the frustration that they are feeling. And I think this frustration was voiced very clearly by an organization that emerges in Oakland, California. And this is a group called the Black Panthers, who were founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And what they believe in is self-defense, that they see this as a right under the Constitution to carry guns and to defend yourself. And their use of this, I think, really startles people across the country. But I think it's also important for them to understand that they have a real belief that within the black community, we have to do things to aid ourselves. And so I always like to pair the picture of them with the guns, which is always how they're represented, along with the fact that they did a number of things in the community, like having food banks and free lunches and breakfast for children. So they also believed that it was important to find ways to nurture the people within their community. So you have, on one hand, this growing sector of individuals who believe that maybe nonviolence is not the best way to go. And you have King, on the other hand, who's suggesting that nonviolence is the best thing to have happen. And I think it's important to keep these in mind because I think there is a balancing effect that is happening here that's important. That maybe without the voices of those who don't believe in nonviolence, that the response to nonviolence would not have been as strong. And there's some people who argue that very much so. So in our understanding of this civil rights movement, it's critical to recognize other voices that are resonating at the same time. Now, as the Panthers are becoming more in the headlines in 1968, there's also a very tragic event that takes place in the nation. And that takes place in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4th of 1968. There, Martin Luther King Jr., while in Memphis to give a speech in support of garbage workers who were striking there, is assassinated. And many see this as a critical moment in the civil rights movement because for many it is a sapping of the strength and the momentum and the forward motion of that movement. That King is the representative of all that, and his death sort of throws civil rights, at least nonviolent civil rights, into less focus than it had been before. And in many ways, this is not a bad place to look at the modern civil rights movement as coming to a critical moment. Because I think it shifts after that, and it changes its emphasis. And one of the things that happens is that you don't have an individual who becomes the spokesperson for the African American community for civil rights. It now begins to, I think, spread out more widely. And also, the local level becomes much more important. But so in many ways, I think his death is an important sort of coda for understanding that modern civil rights movement, because I think it represents the successes, but also the failures that went with that. And it also points out that the efforts that take place during this modern civil rights movement have a number of challenges. But the goal of the movement itself, I think, is to get the nation to begin to think about how it's going to look at access to citizenship, how it's going to think about what do the words in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence really mean, and how we as a nation going to really adhere to those things and live up to them, or are they just sort of words on a paper, or are they words that only apply to certain parts of the population? King would argue no. I think even the voices who aren't supporting nonviolence would argue no as well. But what we understand is that there was some progress that happened during the civil rights movement that I'm talking about now, that I would say sort of changes after 1968. But at the same time, what we do recognize is that in the years that have followed, while there's been some progress, we also have had steps backward. And that the challenges that they talked about, even with the progress, still exist. And I think the challenge to us as a nation is, what do we stand for? And do we believe the rights of citizenship should be extended to a wide variety of people, or are they only for certain special people within the society? I believe the modern civil rights movement was about finding ways in which we begin to expand the sense of citizenship, expand the sense of who has the rights of having these rights of citizenship, that freedom should be applied to everyone, equality should be applied to everyone, and not to a favored few. So that in sort of reprising the story of the modern civil rights movement, I hope it serves as a reminder of what people who are dedicated to change can do, and how important it is, as Martin Luther King said in his letter from the Birmingham jail, that unjust laws, unjust actions need to be pushed back against. And if we do this, the society can change in different kinds of ways. But without people pushing back, change doesn't happen. And what I think the modern civil rights movement represents is people pushing back and causing change to occur. Thank you for coming tonight.